In the annals of American true crime, there are cases that defy understanding, not because they're complex, but because they're too simple, too intimate. This is one of those cases. A family of four, slaughtered inside a quiet suburban home. No signs of forced entry, no signs of robbery, no sign that anyone tried to fight back. Only one thing was missing: the father. At first, it looked like a domestic tragedy buried under the guise of silence. But what investigators would later uncover was not a random act of violence. It was premeditated, calculated, a massacre planned not by a stranger in the night, but from within the walls of a broken marriage. This was the Kaler family case, an event that would ripple through the justice system and raise disturbing questions about rage, control, and the limits of the human psyche. And it all began with a single unanswered call. The call came in late. The boy on the other end sounded calm, but strained. He hadn't heard from his mother, sisters, or grandmother all day. It was a holiday, and the silence wasn't just unusual, it was wrong. He hadn't been able to reach anyone since the night before. He was staying with his father, as per the parenting agreement. But now, something felt off. "I've tried their phones, no one's answering," he told the dispatcher. "Can someone check on them?" The house was located on a quiet street, just outside a small Midwestern town. The kind of place where neighbors still brought over pie during the holidays. Where porch lights flickered on around dusk and locked doors were more about habit than fear. But that night, something in the air felt heavier. When officers arrived, the house appeared untouched. A silver sedan was parked neatly in the driveway. No open doors, no broken windows. From the outside, nothing betrayed the horror waiting inside. The responding officers knocked several times. No response. They circled the perimeter, checked windows, called out names. Still nothing. They obtained a key from a relative nearby and stepped inside. What they found didn't match the setting. A table half set for dinner. A half-empty bottle of wine on the counter. The television still on in the background, casting a soft flicker across the living room. But no sounds of laughter. No signs of movement. Just an unnatural quiet. Too quiet. Then they noticed the details. A purse left open on the floor. A phone buzzing on a coffee table, screen cracked. A trail of faint reddish-brown droplets along the hardwood floor, leading toward the hallway. What followed was the kind of discovery no officer forgets. 4 bodies, each in a different room. A mother, her 2 teenage daughters, and her own elderly mother. All shot, all dead. No signs of struggle. No screams reported by neighbors, no broken furniture. Only clean, deliberate violence. The home became a crime scene. Yellow tape sealed off the block. The forensic unit was called in, along with homicide detectives. The scene suggested methodical execution. Each victim shot at close range, likely caught off guard. All of them women, all of them family. Karen, the mother, had been living there temporarily with her daughters and mother during a difficult separation. Those who knew her described her as thoughtful, soft-spoken, and devoted to her children. She had recently moved back to her hometown to get away from a deteriorating situation. That situation now was at the center of a quadruple homicide. Initial investigation ruled out burglary. Jewelry, electronics, cash. Nothing had been taken. The family dog hadn't barked, and there was no forced entry. This wasn't random. This was someone they knew. Someone they trusted enough to let in, or someone who didn't need to ask. That's when investigators turned their attention to one person who was conspicuously absent. The father, James Craig Kaler, former utilities director, recently unemployed, in the middle of a bitter divorce, and nowhere to be found. Neighbors were interviewed. Surveillance footage was pulled from surrounding intersections and businesses. A BOLO, be on the lookout alert, was issued by midnight. While the rest of the town was winding down from a quiet holiday, law enforcement was gearing up for what they suspected could be one of the worst domestic murders the state had ever seen. But what made this case particularly chilling wasn't just the brutality. It was the intimacy of it, the closeness between the victims and their suspected killer. It wasn't just a family torn apart. It was a family annihilated. And as officers began piecing together the timeline, interviewing friends, neighbors, and relatives, they kept coming back to one central question. What could drive a man to kill his entire family? The answer, as it would turn out, had been building for years. The crime scene had already begun to cool when the forensic team completed its first sweep. Outside the home, law enforcement maintained a perimeter, while behind closed doors, silence draped the space like a heavy blanket. It was that lingered, not just because of death, but because of how little resistance had been offered. That fact alone disturbed investigators more than the blood itself. The victims had not fought back. Inside the house, a layout of love now read like a floor plan of tragedy. The grandmother had been found near the entrance of the guest room, one hand outstretched toward the hallway, as if she'd heard something, risen from bed, before understanding what was happening. One of the daughters lay curled against the base of her bed, still in her sleep clothes, as though caught mid-dream. The second girl was discovered at the foot of the stairs, not far from the family's Labrador retriever, who remained unharmed but visibly shaken. Karen, the mother, had been found last, collapsed near the living room, slumped against the wall with the television still flickering above her. None of them had made it out of the house alive. All four had died where they fell. No one had called 911. No one had screamed loud enough for neighbors to notice. This wasn't a frenzied act of violence. It was surgical, controlled. Someone had walked through that home with intent, taking the lives of four women without hesitation or noise. The killer didn't panic. He didn't rush. That precision was perhaps the most chilling of all. The deeper the investigators looked, the more personal the picture became. Karen Kaler had moved into the house with her daughters only a few months prior. Friends said she was trying to start over. After years of an increasingly hostile relationship, she had finally begun taking steps toward independence. She'd left the marital home, taken the children with her, and reached out to extended family for shelter. It wasn't easy. Karen had no illusions about what separation would mean, but those close to her believed she had reached a point where fear no longer outweighed the need for peace. She had a reserved strength, quiet but certain. In communities, she was known as someone who put her children above everything else. Her older daughter had spoken about becoming a teacher. The younger, athletic and headstrong, wanted to be a marine biologist. Their lives had direction. Their futures had weight. The day before the killings, they were seen at a local diner with their grandmother, laughing over milkshakes. There was no indication they knew they were in danger. And yet, as investigators combed through the house, a subtle but undeniable pattern began to emerge. A family photograph had been knocked from the hallway shelf. Another one of Karen and her daughters had been found face down near the stairs. In Karen's bedroom, a box of court papers sat on her desk, documents related to potential separation, and statements describing verbal intimidation. It was becoming increasingly clear this wasn't a random act. It was part of a larger, ongoing struggle, one that Karen had fought quietly for years. In homicide cases, especially those involving multiple victims, the motive is rarely unclear. Love turned to control, control turned to resentment, and eventually resentment boils into something irreversible. This pattern before, but what made this case stand out, what froze even seasoned detectives, was the scale, the completeness. 4 generations erased in a single night, without even the suggestion of reeled, so did the public conversation. How does a woman ask for help before something like this happens? Why do warning signs so often fall through the cracks? And how could a place that seems so normal Across the street, neighbors placed candles on the sidewalk. A former classmate of one of the daughters left a note that read, "You always made me smile in biology. I'm sorry this world failed." That evening, even before names were confirmed. Though the town had seen crime before, it had never seen devastation like this. Back at the scene, officers continued searching for signs, any sign. There were none. Door locks were intact, window screens undisturbed. The security system had been off, which Karen sometimes did to let her elderly mother move freely at night. Nothing was missing, no valuables disturbed, no furniture was off. In the kitchen trash bin, beneath discarded packaging and food wrappers, a torn-up greeting card was found. The handwriting was male, the content vague but unsettling. "We gave you everything. You broke us. Now you want to walk away?" The note hadn't been signed. Investigators would later use handwriting analysis to confirm its origin. But in that moment, its existence was an investigation, from uncertain to deeply personal. It wasn't just a crime, it was the collapse of a private war. One that had been fought behind closed doors long before the trigger was ever pulled. And still, the man whose presence was conspicuously absent had yet to be found. The victim's son, Sean, remained in protective custody. At his age, he shouldn't have had to process this kind of grief. noted his calm demeanor in the early hours, interpreting it not as indifference, but as shock manifesting in silence. He asked about his dog. He asked who would plan the funeral, but he didn't ask how his family had died. Gently questioned about the last time he'd seen his father, Sean paused. He said he needed to be alone, he told them. He didn't want to talk about Mom anymore, just kept saying, "You'll see." On the surface. But paired with the evidence slowly coming together, it was one more piece of a puzzle that pointed toward the man missing from every room in that house. The father, the husband, the one person Karen had recently filed court documents against. Law enforcement widened their search. Units across counties were notified. Airports and bus stations flagged his name. For the moment, he was a person of interest. But inside the department, few doubted what direction this investigation was heading. In the hours that followed, forensic teams began compiling reports. Each bullet recovered matched. There were no signs of defensive wounds. Every shot had been precise, calculated, and each one had been delivered from within 6 feet of the victim. The killer had been close, physically, emotionally. Spread, the case caught the attention of state-level authorities. Advocates for domestic violence prevention began highlighting it as an example of systemic failure. Karen had spoken up. She had tried a world where threats don't always come with bruises. Too often the signs are only taken seriously once it's too late. By nightfall, the Kaler residence had become more than a crime scene. It had become a simple tale, a reflection of how easily lives can be extinguished not by strangers, but by the people once closest to us. And the man they were looking for still hadn't made contact. There was no confession, no suicide, just an absence, haunting and deliberate, that left investigators racing the clock. The autopsy reports confirmed what the scene had already whispered. Each victim had been killed swiftly, with precision. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication that anyone had attempted to flee or even fully register what was happening. It was not just a crime of violence, it was a systematic erasure, one by one, room by room. Investigators reconstructed the timeline with quiet intensity. Their work was meticulous. They walked the floors repeatedly, marking patterns, angles, and distances. Forensic lasers mapped the bullet trajectories, matching entry wounds to shell casing positions. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The killer had known the layout of the house intimately. The way they moved through it suggested familiarity, not exploration. They didn't search, they executed. Karen was the last to die. That detail mattered. She had likely heard the shots, maybe even called out. But she hadn't made it to her daughters in time. Her body was found closest to the central hallway, just a few feet from the stairs leading up to where her youngest daughter had fallen. Her right hand showed signs of contact with the wall, smudges of blood trailing downward. It was as if she had tried to stay standing, even as life slipped away. In the weeks to follow, trauma specialists would revisit the scene, not for evidence, but to study the psychological sequence of the killings. It mattered in understanding the case's full weight. The order of death in a family homicide often reveals intention. The daughters had been killed first, then the grandmother, and finally Karen. A descending hierarchy of vulnerability. The killer had eliminated the most defenseless before turning to the strongest. It was more than method, it was messaging. That kind of cruelty isn't random. Investigators took stock of the home's contents. Personal items were cataloged. Photographs, journals, school papers, family heirlooms, all left untouched. The family dog was found hiding under a desk, unharmed but visibly shaken. Behavioral experts later noted that animals in trauma often retreat to the last place they felt safe. In this case, the dog had crawled beneath the desk in the master bedroom, Karen's space. For detectives, the emotional impact of the case deepened by the hour. Even seasoned officers, those who had spent years in violent crimes, paused between shifts in silence. Some opted out of press briefings, not because they lacked information, but because their voices trembled when forced to recount the details. The community, still reeling, searched for answers that the facts could not immediately provide. What was clear, though, was the killer's intent, not just to destroy lives, but to silence them completely. In family annihilation cases, patterns tend to emerge, not in the act itself, but in what comes before. A fractured relationship, a controlling dynamic, Legal proceedings that escalate. The days leading up to the Kaler murders revealed such a pattern. Karen had recently formalized steps toward a divorce, and the paperwork left behind on her desk was telling. Custody filings, financial affidavits, and documentation of prior threats had been meticulously arranged in a file marked pending. It wasn't fear that had stopped her from following through. It was a system too slow to act. One document contained a note in Karen's handwriting, likely written weeks before her death. It read simply, "If anything happens to me, please make sure the girls are safe." The chilling clarity of her foresight added a new layer to the investigation. Karen had not just feared for herself. She had feared for her children. And still, they had been unable to escape what came. The forensic team uncovered a partial boot print on the tile floor near the back door. It was subtle, missed during the initial sweep, but once illuminated with luminol, it revealed itself. A right-side print with a clear tread pattern. It matched a popular brand of tactical boot. Investigators photographed, casted, and bagged the sample for further analysis. If matched to a known individual, it could help place someone directly at the scene. In the living room, a laptop had been left open on the coffee table. The screen had gone black, but when rebooted, the browser history showed recent searches related to child custody laws, restraining orders, and local court schedules. The timestamps placed the last use within hours of the murders. Whether Karen had done those searches, or whether someone else had, is a detail investigators would soon clarify through forensic digital analysis. Each new discovery painted a fuller picture of what had happened, but still failed to answer the looming question, where was the father? His absence had shifted from suspicious to ominous. While his name had not yet been publicly released, law enforcement agencies across the state had been alerted. His image had been quietly circulated among transportation hubs, border crossings, and neighboring jurisdictions. The search had begun, but time was already slipping. One of the more haunting discoveries came during a secondary sweep of the grandmother's bedroom. Inside a drawer, among folded linens, was a photo album marked Family First. The opening page featured an image from years earlier. Karen smiling beside her husband with 3 young children in their laps. Their eyes were bright, the faces unburdened. It was a portrait of what the family used to be. The investigators who found it didn't disturb the album. They closed the drawer gently and left it where it lay. That moment, quiet, reflective, painfully human, reminded them of the stakes beyond the evidence. These weren't just victims. They were people with lives that had once been whole. And that, more than anything, was why the truth had to be pursued relentlessly. In the unfolding narrative of the Kaler murders, a chilling silence echoed louder than any scream. The silence of a man who should have been the first to arrive, the first to grieve, the first to demand answers. Instead, he had vanished. James Craig Kaler had once been a man admired by many. A mechanical engineer by training and former director of water and electric utilities, he held positions of public trust. His resume included leadership roles, awards for innovation, and letters of recommendation from city officials. He was, to those who didn't know him intimately, the embodiment of middle-class success. Clean-cut, articulate, dependable. But in private, that image had begun to corrode. The collapse of his marriage to Karen was not sudden, nor was it subtle. Over the previous 2 years, friends of the couple noticed a gradual unraveling. At first, there were canceled plans, awkward silences at community events, and whispers of long hours spent apart. Then came the formal separation, followed by court filings that exposed something deeper. Allegations of emotional abuse, manipulation, and threatening behavior. Karen had detailed her concerns to legal counsel, documenting incidents in which Craig's demeanor shifted from charming to controlling. She described emotional volatility, obsessive behavior, and a growing fear that she and the children were being watched, even after moving out. But like many in her situation, Karen encountered a justice system hesitant to act preemptively. Restraining orders can be hard to obtain without clear evidence of physical danger. And so, while paperwork moved through the courts, Karen moved into her mother's home, trying to shield her daughters from conflict while maintaining some semblance of normalcy. That effort ended in blood. Now, as investigators traced the contours of the crime, Craig's absence loomed larger with each passing hour. His home was empty. His cell phone had gone silent. His last known transaction, a gas station purchase, had taken place the day before the murders. Security footage captured his vehicle pulling into the lot just after sunset, alone, unhurried. The timestamp placed him less than 20 miles from the scene. Law enforcement teams executed a search warrant on his residence, located in another part of the state. Inside, they found few personal belongings. The refrigerator was nearly empty. The living room, stripped of decor, looked as if someone had already left for good. On the kitchen counter, however, sat one item that investigators would later consider symbolic: a family photograph, half charred in a small ceramic dish. The burn marks didn't reach the faces, but the damage was deliberate, not accidental, not grief-driven, intentional. Technicians recovered computers, external hard drives, and handwritten journals. Some pages had been ripped out, others were blacked out with thick, permanent marker. One entry, dated a few weeks earlier, read, "They have taken everything, my name, my family, my worth. I will not be forgotten." Back at the police station, investigators began building a timeline, placing Craig's movements alongside what little evidence remained of the hours leading up to the murders. The children's school records confirmed they had been dismissed early for the holiday. Karen had picked them up personally, then driven to a local bakery. Witnesses there remembered the girls excitedly talking about baking cookies. No signs of distress, no signs of fear. They arrived home around late afternoon. Neighbors heard laughter, music. One neighbor recalled the scent of pumpkin spice wafting through the air. It was, by all appearances, a normal family evening, until it wasn't. The lack of forced entry now pointed more clearly to one conclusion. The killer either had a key or had been let in. The front door had shown no signs of tampering, neither had the windows, and the security system, though functional, had been disarmed. Investigators later confirmed the code had not been changed since Karen moved in. She had trusted that only family knew it. When detectives spoke with Craig's extended relatives, they encountered mixed reactions. Some were shocked, unwilling to believe he could be involved. Others were quiet. One brother, who asked not to be identified publicly, described Craig in recent months as unrecognizable. He spoke of growing isolation, obsessive speech patterns, and a deepening hatred for the divorce process. He felt like he was losing everything, the man said, and he blamed Karen. But emotional distress, no matter how severe, does not explain mass murder. The goal of the investigation was not just to piece together motive, but to secure evidence that could hold up in court. Every search, every interview, every digital trace was a building block toward that end. A forensic specialist reviewing traffic cameras found something compelling. A dark SUV matching the description of Craig's vehicle was recorded traveling a rural back road roughly 40 minutes before the estimated time of the killings. The vehicle made a slow turn onto a gravel path, one that led toward the Kaler residence from a back route. The camera caught only the vehicle's silhouette, but the timestamp and location lined up with the rest of the emerging timeline. Investigators issued an alert across the state, expanding the search radius. They traced known financial accounts, pinged cellular towers, and contacted nearby hospitals and motels. At the same time, digital analysts began combing through Craig's devices, slowly unraveling a profile that painted a man descending into obsession. Online searches included articles about revenge, family law, and firearms. One query asked, "How long does it take police to respond to a domestic shooting?" The findings were damning, but still, no physical confirmation of Craig's whereabouts post-crime existed. The goal remained the same: find him alive, secure a confession, or at least secure evidence that left no room for denial. Meanwhile, the media began circling. Though names had not been officially released, the scope of the crime was impossible to ignore. Rumors spread fast, as did amateur theories. Some suggested an unknown intruder, others speculated a jealous lover. But inside the police department, the working theory remained rooted in the facts. The killer had been someone close, someone trusted, someone whose absence now screamed louder than any headline. Back in the small town where the murders occurred, residents struggled to process what had happened. Candlelight vigils continued nightly. At the local high school, where both daughters had once been students, a table was set up with photographs, letters, and flowers. One note, written in pencil on a lined sheet of paper, simply said, "She always stood up for the quiet kids. I wish someone could have stood up for her." That sentence struck a chord with detectives, because behind every homicide case lies not just a broken law, but a broken chain of protection. Karen had done what many do. She sought help through legal channels, spoke to friends, moved to a safer location. But the reality is that the danger often arrives not as a stranger, but as someone already inside the circle. By the end of the fourth day, the Kaler case had grown from a local investigation into a national story. The FBI offered support. Profilers began sketching behavioral maps, and every highway patrol unit in the state was placed on alert. James Craig Kaler had become more than a missing person. He was now the central figure in a case that demanded resolution not just for justice, but for a community shattered by betrayal from within. The manhunt had begun. In many homicide cases, the suspect's apprehension is a matter of hours. Surveillance, phone records, witness statements, they often converge quickly. But in this investigation, the suspect didn't vanish into a crowd or flee across state lines. Instead, he slipped into the margins, moving just far enough from the grid to delay what most believed to be inevitable. Authorities had already determined that James Craig Kaler had left no digital trail beyond the day of the murders. His phone had powered down hours before the killings. His vehicle, an SUV consistent with sightings near the crime scene, had not been located. He hadn't accessed his bank accounts, he hadn't returned home, and he hadn't attempted to make contact with anyone. The absence of activity was deliberate. Investigators feared what this silence could mean. Was he hiding, planning another act, dead by his own hand? The unknown created pressure, not just within law enforcement, but across the community, still clinging to the fragile hope of closure. The search was focused on rural Osage County, wooded, vast, and sparsely patrolled. It was a region filled with old service roads, forgotten barns, and dry creeks that ran deep through the land. Volunteers joined law enforcement, helicopters swept tree lines. K-9 units were deployed to trace scent trails from the last confirmed sighting. It was, by every standard, a full-scale operation. Yet it was still missing one thing: a direction. That changed late on the fourth day. A utility worker performing routine maintenance near a water treatment station noticed a man walking along a brushy embankment near the creek. Disheveled, slow-moving, and alone. Not someone who appeared to belong in the area. When approached, the man didn't flee. He didn't speak. He simply looked up and sat down on the rocks beside the water. Minutes later, officers arrived. The man had no identification, but they knew who he was. It was James Craig Kaler. He didn't resist. He didn't explain. His clothes were damp, his hands scraped. He'd been out in the elements for days. A worn backpack lay beside him, partially unzipped. Inside were protein bars, a flashlight, and a single photograph. Karen and the children, smiling, arms linked, posed in front of a field of sunflowers. The picture had been folded in half, then folded again. There was no firearm on him at the time of arrest. That would come later. Back at the sheriff's office, Kaler remained mostly silent. He invoked his right to counsel, and formal interrogation was postponed. Still, investigators began piecing together what they could from his physical condition, the contents of the bag, and the terrain he'd traveled. Tracking dogs later retraced his route. He had crossed 2 barbed wire fences, used shallow creek beds to conceal his movement, and avoided all major roads. He had camped beneath an abandoned shed just outside a closed hunting property. The nights had been near freezing. The fact that he had survived, despite injuries, lack of supplies, and no fire, spoke to planning. He hadn't run out of desperation. He had prepared to disappear. And yet, the effort had failed. Whether he intended to be found, or whether exhaustion caught up to him, remained unclear. What was certain was that the arrest brought a new phase to the case, one no longer about locating a suspect, but about building a case strong enough to withstand scrutiny in a court of law. Prosecutors now turned their attention to the physical evidence. The boot print found near the Kaler residence, previously cast and analyzed, was a match for footwear in Kaler's possession at the time of arrest. His fingerprints, found on the doorknob, Karen's laptop, and the torn greeting card recovered from the trash, further connected him to the crime scene. More damning was the discovery of a firearm during a search of the wooded path he had used to flee. Hidden beneath loose leaves and debris wrapped in a cloth rag was a scoped rifle. Ballistics confirmed a match to the bullets recovered from the victims' bodies. Though he hadn't spoken, his silence was no longer protection. The evidence spoke in his place. Beyond the technical findings, investigators began to focus on motive, not as an abstract concept, but as a narrative. They combed through emails between Karen and her attorney, voicemails from Craig left late at night, text messages to mutual friends, reading like veiled threats. The timeline of emotional decay was fully formed, but now needed to be translated into legal language. In cases involving intimate partner violence, prosecutors often walk a difficult line. Emotions must be respected, but emotion alone does not convict. Every statement had to be corroborated, every thread tied to a physical fact. The truth had to be undeniable, not because of the public outcry, but because the justice system at its best demands proof over outrage. As the arrest was announced publicly, the community responded with a strange mixture of relief and despair. Relief that the man once feared to be a wandering threat was now in custody. Despair that the story had indeed played out as many had quietly suspected. At a local elementary school, a counselor set up a memorial corner for students who had known Lauren and Emily. It included drawings, small toys, and a poster that read, "You are loved, you are remembered." Children too young to fully grasp the concept of murder sat in a circle and talked about friendship, kindness, and why some families have to go live in the stars. In those quiet conversations, the human toll of the case was clearest. No forensic report could quantify the loss. No trial could undo the absence. But the pursuit of justice remained vital, not as vengeance, but as an assertion that life, no matter how fragile, demands accountability. The case against Craig Kaler was taking form, slowly, deliberately, and with precision, mirroring that of the crime itself. But one critical piece still remained untouched: his voice, his story. Whether or not he would offer it voluntarily, or only under legal obligation, remained to be seen. What investigators understood now, more than ever, was this: the truth, while no longer hidden, was not yet fully revealed. The story behind the murders didn't begin with a trigger. It began long before, with small fractures, subtle silences, and repeated cries for help that were acknowledged, but never acted upon with urgency. In the weeks following Craig Kaler's arrest, investigators turned inward, not just toward the crime scene or the physical evidence, but toward the paper trail. The real anatomy of this tragedy could not be found in shell casings or footprints alone. It lived in court transcripts, written affidavits, and counseling records. It breathed through testimonies buried in legal files that had long been passed over with procedural detachment. At the heart of this exploration was one folder, labeled simply Kaler v. Kaler. It contained the unraveling of a marriage and, more critically, the documentation of a slow descent from domestic tension into domestic terror. Karen had filed for divorce after nearly 2 decades of marriage. At first glance, their relationship had followed a familiar arc: college sweethearts, career-driven, 3 children, a modest but secure life. But behind the facade of normalcy, Karen's personal notes and court statements revealed a history of emotional domination that deepened over time. In one affidavit, she described how Craig monitored her communications, restricted her financial independence, and isolated her from longtime friends. The control wasn't always overt. It evolved gradually, through guilt, strategic silence, and disproportionate anger over minor disagreements. One phrase appeared repeatedly in her legal statements: he always had to win. Control became the language of their home, and fear the unspoken rule. Karen had attempted to leave before, twice, but returned, believing their children needed both parents and that Craig's behavior could be managed. She wasn't naive. She was calculating risk and hope in equal measure. And like many survivors of coercive relationships, she prioritized stability over confrontation, for as long as she could. By the time the final petition was filed, the marriage had decayed beyond repair. Karen no longer sought compromise. She wanted safety. Her last court filing, submitted just 2 months before the murders, contained a plea for emergency custody and protection. In it, she detailed what she called unrelenting surveillance by Craig, how he had begun showing up unannounced, sending late-night messages, and making statements she interpreted as veiled threats. Legal experts reviewing the case later identified systemic gaps. Karen's filings, while serious, didn't meet the statutory threshold for a protective order at the time. Judges must weigh threat perception against hard evidence. Without a physical attack or direct threat to life, many cases like Karen's fall into a legal gray area where fear is recognized but not yet quantifiable. Her lawyer had warned her, unless he lays a hand on you or the kids, it's hard to get immediate protection. That sentence, in retrospect, reads like a verdict issued too early. The psychological timeline was equally revealing. A forensic psychologist brought in to analyze the case retrospectively noted that Craig exhibited signs consistent with narcissistic collapse, a term used when an individual with grandiose self-identity perceives their status, role, or control as being permanently threatened. The loss of his wife, his children's emotional distance, and his fading career compounded a perception of humiliation. His identity as a successful father and provider, carefully constructed over decades, was disintegrating, and he didn't know how to live outside of it. It wasn't just grief, it was a loss of narrative. And when someone like Craig could no longer control the story, he sought to control the ending. Digital forensics supported this psychological profile. On his personal laptop, investigators found a folder labeled Proof. Inside were hundreds of screenshots, emails between Karen and her attorney, text messages between her and friends, even calendar appointments. Craig had been building a digital dossier, compiling what he likely saw as betrayals. But none of the documents showed malice. They showed a woman trying to exit quietly, responsibly, and with dignity. She wasn't trying to destroy him. She was trying to protect herself. In addition to this, financial records revealed that Craig had withdrawn large sums of money in the weeks leading up to the murders. Not enough to flee indefinitely, but enough to indicate that something final was being prepared. He had also transferred several personal files onto an encrypted flash drive, later found in his car, which contained a disturbing video diary. In one entry, he looked directly into the camera and said, "They turned me into a ghost. You don't erase a man like that and expect him to just disappear." It was, in effect, a digital suicide note, but he hadn't followed through. Prosecutors saw this material not only as circumstantial but as premeditation. They weren't building a case based on emotion. They were documenting a pattern, one rooted in entitlement, resentment, and ultimately, a need to reclaim power through destruction. Beyond the courtroom, victim advocates began to amplify Karen's story, not to sensationalize her death, but to highlight how many warning signs can go unheeded. Shelters reported an uptick in calls following news coverage. Women in similar situations said they recognized themselves in Karen's quiet strength and her final, unheard pleas. Public conversation shifted from "how could this happen" to "why didn't anyone stop it?" Those close to Karen refused to let her name become a statistic. Her best friend, speaking at a town hall meeting, said, "Karen didn't die because she didn't ask for help. She died because the system didn't believe she needed it. Yet." In the official case file, her story now lived alongside forensic diagrams and evidence logs. But to those who knew her, it would always be something more, a record of endurance cut short. The shadows in the marriage file revealed not only how this tragedy unfolded, but how many doors had been knocked on, how many signals had been sent, how many moments of intervention had passed. Not with drama, not with screams, but with quiet, persistent warning. The first time Craig Kaler sat in the interrogation room, he said nothing. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved detectives. It was the stillness. No twitch, no shift in posture, no visible discomfort. He stared ahead at the blank wall, ignoring the investigators on the other side of the table. Occasionally, his eyes would flick upward, as if scanning the corner of the ceiling where the recording device blinked. But he made no eye contact, no request for water, no question about what would happen next. He didn't deny anything, he didn't admit to anything, he simply existed behind the glass. Interrogators knew this tactic. It wasn't shock, it wasn't remorse, it was control. One last attempt to remain the narrator of a story that was quickly slipping away. By refusing to speak, he denied them the one thing they needed most in that room: motive. They were prepared for that. The lead investigator, a veteran of high-stakes domestic homicide cases, had seen this before. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't throw photos across the table. She simply waited. And while the silence stretched long, the evidence outside that room continued to speak. Forensic teams had built a timeline for more than blood spatter and bullets. They had reconstructed the evening of the murders using digital data, environmental markers, and behavioral patterning. GPS logs pulled from Craig's SUV, retrieved 2 days after his arrest, revealed his vehicle's movement toward the residence on the evening in question. More damningly, the vehicle's internal system recorded a pause just outside a nearby trailhead, exactly where the weapon had been later recovered, wrapped in cloth and buried beneath fallen leaves. The firearm itself, once examined by ballistics experts, proved irrefutable. The rifling marks on the bullets matched the barrel of the rifle exactly. This wasn't a similar weapon, it was the weapon. But physical evidence alone wasn't enough for the prosecution. They needed the case to be airtight. especially given Craig's status and the likely involvement of a skilled defense team. That's where behavioral forensics came in. A criminal profiler assigned to the task studied hundreds of pages of Craig's emails, journal entries, and recorded voicemails. Patterns emerged: obsession, blame shifting, a belief in persecution, and most notably, the repeated phrase, "You made me invisible." This wasn't about loss, it was about erasure. Digital forensics analysts had also accessed deleted folders on his laptop. One contained a series of search terms, chilling in their specificity. How long does it take to bleed out from a chest wound? Best caliber for close-range kill. How to clean gunpowder residue off hands. Another folder, encrypted but eventually decoded, included unsent drafts of letters, one to his children, one to Karen, and one addressed generically to the court. In these, he spoke of betrayal, of being replaced, and of a desire to correct the narrative. The most damning file wasn't a document, though. It was a photo. Dated the night before the murders, it showed Karen and the two girls baking cookies in their grandmother's kitchen. The image had been taken from outside the house, through the kitchen window. The metadata confirmed it came from Craig's personal phone. This wasn't a man who snapped. This was a man who watched, a man who waited. Back in the interrogation room, investigators didn't confront him with this immediately. They started with the basics. Where were you that night? When did you last speak to Karen? Did you own a rifle of this caliber? He said nothing. Even after being shown photos of the crime scene, of the weapon, of the trail where he had been found, his expression didn't change. Not denial, not regret, just silence. But silence, in a legal setting, is not immunity. Later, prosecutors would walk the jury through every inch of this case, from the first 911 call to the final location of the weapon. Each point reinforced the same conclusion. The murders were planned, personal, and exact. The trail wasn't perfect, it was meticulous. Blood spatter analysis revealed that each victim had been shot in a manner consistent with military-style close-quarters engagement. The angles, distances, and entry points all suggested a shooter who understood anatomy and timing. The sequence of shots matched the hypothesis that the children were killed first, followed by the grandmother, and finally Karen. That order wasn't random. It was psychological warfare, meant to destroy everything she loved before ending with her. Further, trace evidence collected from Craig's backpack included plant matter unique to the wooded path behind the residence, samples that matched vegetation found at the scene. Soil analysis confirmed it came from the same region where the rifle was buried. A neighbor's home security camera, which had not initially been reviewed due to a false timestamp, was found to show a vehicle matching Craig's SUV parked at the edge of the property around the time of the murders. It wasn't a clear image, but the timing, the silhouette, and the license plate fragment were more than coincidence. It was connection. The defense, once the case went to trial, would argue that circumstantial evidence does not equate to guilt. But this wasn't circumstantial. This was layered. This was systematic. This was proof. Back at the station, after nearly 5 hours in the interrogation room, Craig was moved to a holding cell. He had spoken only once, to request a Bible. The moment was noted, but not explored. At this stage, investigators no longer needed his words. The case had taken shape around him. The pieces no longer depended on his confession. They stood alone, clinical, precise, undeniable. And yet, behind the glass, he still held the power of ambiguity, not because he would escape justice, but because silence leaves room for speculation. And in that space, truth can twist. But not this time. This time, every footprint, every fingerprint, every digital breadcrumb had already answered the question he refused to confront out loud. By the time the trial began, the courtroom was already overflowing with tension. National media lined the courthouse steps. Local residents, many of whom had known the Kaler family for years, sat in near silence, waiting to witness a reckoning. It wasn't just about justice, it was about answers. Closure, perhaps, if such a thing truly existed after the annihilation of an entire family. The prosecution entered the courtroom with a strategy built not on spectacle but on relentless clarity. Their case did not rely on emotion. It leaned heavily on fact. They presented the GPS data, the matching ballistics, the soil samples from the path where the weapon had been buried. They showed security footage, the digital forensics from Craig's laptop, and the series of obsessive screenshots and unsent messages that revealed a pattern of stalking, control, and premeditation. Their central thesis was simple. Craig Kaler didn't just kill his family, He planned it, stalked them, and executed the murders with intention and full awareness. The prosecutors knew they had no confession, no eyewitnesses, but they had the weapon, the motive, the timeline, and the silence. And in many ways, that silence was the loudest admission of all. On the defense side, the strategy was more complex. Without the possibility of denying Craig's presence near the scene, they leaned into psychological territory. They framed him as a man unraveling, a man pushed to his breaking point by the collapse of a life he had built for decades. They introduced experts who spoke of depressive episodes, emotional instability, and a possible dissociative state. But the prosecution was ready. They dismantled the temporary insanity angle point by point, showing how methodically Craig had planned his exit, tracked his family, and erased his digital presence. A man in psychological freefall does not bury a rifle and wipe his hard drives. And then came the most difficult testimony of all. Sean Kaler, the sole surviving child, took the stand. His voice was steady, his posture calm, but beneath the surface, the weight of his presence was undeniable. He spoke not about the night of the murders, he hadn't been in the house, but about the months leading up to it. He described the fear in his mother's voice, the tension in every exchange between his parents, the time he caught his father parked across the street from his grandmother's house, just sitting there watching. When asked how he felt sitting in the same room as the man who had taken his family, he paused. Then he answered, "He used to teach me how to ride a bike. Now I have to remind myself that this is real, that this isn't a dream I'm supposed to wake up from." That moment shattered whatever remnants of doubt may have lingered. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the courtroom stood in silence, guilty, 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, composed but visibly affected, delivered the sentence, death. Craig sat still, showing no reaction, no visible shock, no protest. For a man who had once thrived on control, the loss of power had settled in like a final, irreversible silence. But outside that courtroom, the story didn't end. It echoed through policies, through families, through the systems that had failed to act. In the months following the trial, Karen's story became a rallying cry for advocates of domestic violence prevention. Lawmakers cited her case in legislative chambers, proposing expanded definitions of emotional abuse and broader criteria for emergency protective orders. Training for law enforcement on coercive control increased across several counties. Family courts reviewed protocols on flagging potential lethality in custody disputes. A new foundation was formed in Karen's name, offering legal and emotional support to individuals seeking to leave controlling relationships. Survivors began sharing their own stories, ones with striking parallels to hers, but with endings that, thanks to renewed awareness, had not turned fatal. Sean, now living under the guardianship of relatives, chose to remain largely out of the public eye. But in a statement released through his attorney, he wrote, "I don't know if justice is a real thing. My family is gone. But what I do know is this. My mom fought for us. She tried to protect us. She mattered. And so did my sisters. I will spend the rest of my life making sure they're not forgotten." It wasn't about closure. There's no neat ending to a tragedy like this. But it was about remembering, about honoring, and about transforming grief into something that might one day save someone else. The Kaler murders were never just a story of a man who lost control. They were a mirror to a deeper failure, a reminder that domestic violence isn't always visible, and that danger doesn't always arrive with fists or bruises. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in obsession, in the slow erasure of autonomy until there is nothing left but fear. Karen's voice may have been quiet, but it was never absent. Her final court documents, her messages to friends, even her note to her lawyer, "If anything happens to me, make sure the girls are safe," now stand as her testimony. And her son's survival stands as her legacy. In the end, it wasn't the courtroom that gave the final word. It was the community, the survivors, the people who heard her story and vowed not to let it happen again. Because the true measure of justice isn't in a verdict. It's in what we do after. It's in the laws we change, the voices we amplify, the lives we save because we finally chose to listen. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.